get right into it. We're going to start here. My name is Marcus Ford, here with Chris Chandler and Brandon Lee. We are the Corrections Community Podcast. We are very happy to be here. This is something that we've been wanting to do since the inception of our show here. We're going to be talking about equity in community corrections and what that looks like, and what better person to do that with than Brandon Lee. I'm going to introduce Brandon a little bit, but I'm going to definitely turn it over to him to introduce himself some more, because he has a plethora of things that he has been involved with in Oregon, internationally, and across the country. So Brandon, he's got a master's in teaching. He's taught and learned in numerous countries around the world and numerous organizations. He was the first grand historian of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge here in our region, kind of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, I believe. He's involved in, or has been involved in, the Oregon Law Enforcement Data Collection and Policy Review Committee that was responsible for House Bill 2355. He's been involved with the NAACP. He has taught and led conversations around racism, trauma, healing, police brutality, best practices in law enforcement, leading with race. He's got a book that's out, and there's also a revision coming this fall, 2021. It's called Best Practices in Community Conscious Policing. So yeah, really excited to have you here. Thank you for being here. And like I said, you're so much more than those things that I said. So give us a little bit of your story.
Sure. First, I just want to thank you, Marcus and Chris, for inviting me to share space with you today. Appreciate the generous introduction. I have definitely been working for quite some time, even before I knew that I would be working in with law enforcement and community. I think I've always kind of been on this path. My story begins in Oakland, California. I was, my mom, my mother's side of the family, grandparents came from Texas. My grandmother was from Port Arthur, my grandfather in Longview, Texas. My grandfather attended Prairie View A&M University, a historically black college university. And a little bit about, I guess, his story to kind of kick off the conversation, and then I'll weave more of my story in through the conversation. He was a college graduate. He owned a tailoring business. He was famous for accentuating the parts that men would want to share in their suits or show in their suits, and for kind of hiding the parts that men wouldn't want to display in their suits. And so that was Grandma said that was his niche. So he was successful, owned his own business, and the way that he never told me the story, but the way that it was shared with me, kind of oral tradition, was he got a 1949 cherry red Buick convertible, and he was, I guess, somewhere in rural Texas, was stopped by local law enforcement back then, especially if you were considered what they would call uppity or had some level of success. He feared for his life. I don't know exactly how, but in some type of way he was able to defend himself, get out of that situation. But when he got home, the story had already made it to town, and he had to leave before nightfall, essentially. And that's kind of the oral tradition that was passed on how he came to California. And so, it's the work that I do has definitely been embedded, from a cultural perspective. And I'll share a little bit more as we get more into the questions. But yeah, from Oakland, California, and now living and working out of Portland.
Yeah, and you do a lot of work with law enforcement in this area. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the context was, number one, I'm an educator. It's my background. So what brought me to Oregon first was I was a faculty member and administrator, the first director of fraternity and sorority life at Oregon State University. And I taught English as a second language. And so I was at Oregon State University. This is maybe around 2012, 13, 14. So this would have been Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and the students that I were working with to support didn't have any spaces to go on campus to be able to process what was going through. There were hate crimes happening on campus simultaneously. So there was just a lot of targeted incidents, and some of my students were literally flunking out of school. So it started merely as a space to how do we create or design some type of space to support our students. And so from that conversation, we administered some student surveys, and in the feedback, we didn't find out, but students confirmed that they were having some racial profiling related circumstances by police. But the only thing was they didn't name the particular agency, right? And so that's in some of our advocacy work, is letting folks know what to pay attention to. So I was NAACP Legal Redress Committee Chairman. We took these surveys to our local law enforcement. There was the City of Corvallis Police Department. As far as the world of public safety, they've earned a lot of different accreditations, CALIA accredited, a lot of respect, as far as in the public safety realm, at least at that time. I'm not sure, since then. And they embraced the conversation with us. So that was a pivotal moment. If I would have had, a specific agency to speak to in regards to these student surveys, then we probably would have began the conversation from a legal redress perspective. But they were receptive. They had quantitative data. I had qualitative data, stories. And so, when two bosses sit down, peace has to dwell. And so from that, we designed our first community conscious policing workshop. And giving shout out and respect to Corvallis Police Department for this was a community-led effort. We designed it. Myself, I identify as a Black American, but my wife is Asian Cambodian refugee. So we were the impacted communities. And we did our first training. And from there, we were tapped by Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. I think this time was George Floyd in Baltimore. So literally there were states of emergency during the time when we were doing this. And we brought law enforcement from around the state. We recruited community members. Law enforcement came, no uniforms, no guns, at least very least concealed. And, we trained law enforcement and community together. And I think it was the first time that we've had that many community members in the law enforcement training center in Salem. So anyway, that was kind of the blueprint of our work, the local level in Corvallis, and then the statewide level with, dozens of agencies for annual spring training.
That's awesome that you bring that up. One of the things that's really important is when we talk about quantitative versus qualitative data in minority communities, storytelling is such an important piece. And I like that you said that, but then you also started our podcast here with the story. So I just wanted to reflect on that and stuff that go ahead, Chris.
Well, I want to, so, we're talking about your origin story here a bit. And, you just talked about how you, the beginning of your advocacy, starting here in Corvallis, and then the story about your grandfather in Texas. And I know we can get into kind of trauma and generational trauma, but before we do that, I want to get more into your story, because I know you came to Oregon from Oakland, California. And so I want to hear more about your experience. I know that in previous conversations you haven't had a lot of contact with folks who work in our field in community corrections, but you have had experience working with law enforcement, and not just working for law enforcement or with law enforcement, just kind of those interactions that you had growing up. Can you tell us some more about that?
Sure. Great question. So let me kind of paint the picture. This would have been the 1980s, early 90s. So this is, during that time, we refer to it as the crack era, the crack epidemic. From our lens, it was kind of it wasn't kind of, there was an effort to what they call neutralize groups like the Black Panthers and things that they stood for. So drugs were kind of placed in our communities, and so Oakland was like one of the first places, and so it hit our area hard. So this is the context, and so in the context of the crack era now, we reflect on it. It's we speak about it like the dope era. There's more of a respect for what we went through and what we had to overcome. So my first probably engagement personally, well, number one, my dad was successful businessman. So my first probably recollections were driving around town in his Porsche, right? And being kind of conditioned to what to expect when it came to law enforcement and why we were always getting pulled over and how come he always fit the description. So those were things that you just notice growing up. And then as you become a certain age, that age is normally around 14, 16. As soon as you start looking that age group, now you go from being cute to being perceived as a threat. There's already like federal, funding and pressure to target people like me. So, the new Jim Crow written by Michelle Alexander well chronicles, the stories of people, my peer group in Oakland in the 80s and the South in the 90s. So by 14, I was the only black male admitted to my college preparatory high school. That's the name of it. It's ranked number 1 private school in California this year, number 4 in the country. So it's, elite level. And I was visiting my cousin in West Oakland, walking across a parking lot. 3 black and white police cars come in. They come in screeching tires, right? Full blast, screeching tires, jumping out, guns pulled, get on the ground. There's just me in an empty parking lot walking, right? So you have 6 officers, guns pulled. I'm jumping on the floor, have no idea what's going on, eating the dust and the dirt. And that led to a 2-hour long detainment, right? Where I was just, everything from, making fun of my name, Brandon Lee, telling me the school that I attended didn't exist, just, harassment, until luckily my cousins in the area got wind of what was happening and came and what I would just say applied legal pressure to convince them that it would be in everybody's best interest if they let me go home. And, they did. But had I not have, my community support, my family to come and get me out that situation, I very easily could have been, another blip on the radar screen as far as the statistics. So that was like my first incident, and reporting it to the OPD thinking that I would get some help and not even getting a call back, right, from internal affairs. So that's like at 14 what like memorable event, started me in this work.
Well, just speaking from my perspective, I'm very happy that you're here. Like that is a scary situation. And if you didn't have, whatever your story was that you had growing up, if you didn't have all those things in place to get you to a place of safety in that moment, the proverbial cracks, you may have fallen through them. So, and you've ended up doing so much good across the country and internationally. And so, it's just an impactful thing, right? When you think about how many people did fall through the cracks that haven't had that chance to have that impact.
Facts. Thank you for the kind words. Yeah.
So as you've been doing this work now for a while, what is your mission? Like what drives you,
In the beginning, and I won't say in the beginning, even still, really it was, beginning at Oregon State as far as Training for Transformation is the name of our business. And so Training for Transformation began here in Oregon. But I guess the journey between, as you mentioned, Chris, my origins from Oakland, having traveled abroad, having had that privilege and honor, having to learn how to navigate different systems. And as a black man, some places it's celebrated, other places it's targeted. I moved at the age of 16 to Texas. I was still in high school. So navigating, the South as an only child, attending Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and spending another 13 years in the South. That's where I would say my fraternalism, and we'll get into that later, but where I saw that your network and, in terms of learning life lessons, have you, the elders, the multi-generational wisdom of how to navigate under pressure was so vital, right? And tapping into those who had come before me. So those were definitely lessons that I try to integrate in my work now. What moves me or what inspires me, I would have to say would be an incident related to corrections, which was Sandra Bland. The Sandra Bland incident, she died in police custody. It was in a jail near Prairie View A&M University, where my grandfather attended college. Again, historically black university, and that area where she got stopped is a road that I would travel often between Houston and Baylor University. So I knew that area very well, had traveled that area before, had my own run-ins with law enforcement while I was in college there. Luckily, again, I had networks to be able to maneuver and family support to get out of those situations, but she didn't. And therein lies, like you said, not everybody makes it through. So as a black woman, right, without the same type of networks and privilege that I had, she was a prime example. So when that happened, I was a new father of I have a wonderful son, beautiful son, but we had just had twin daughters. So when Sandra Bland occurred, that incident occurred, I'm sitting here with my two babies. I'm a stay-at-home dad. So that's what inspired me to kind of reflect on my experiences, not just what I had been through, but where I was able to support others through advocacy. And then now, like, okay, how do we take all these lessons learned and move forward? And so that's where the book of Community Conscious Policing came from. And I started writing as a stay-at-home dad. So it's watching people who had been impacted, who didn't have at least what I had to defend themselves, was definitely an inspiration to say, how can we contribute to making this space better than how I found it, staring in the eyes of my daughter. So that was, what encouraged me to step up and to speak up.
Wow. Yeah. I'm thinking about all the connections that you've made as you're talking about how network is important and all that. And our connection where we first intersected was around the same time that we had started this podcast. It was in July of 2020. It was in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. There was a lot of unrest in the country, especially here in Portland. And we, as my agency, we didn't know what to do. We were just like lost. We're like, we need to talk about this, but we don't know how to talk about that. And one of the things that you're known for, one of the things that you pioneer is this idea of building relationships as part of everything that we do. And so you actually led, you and your business, Training for Transformation, led a conversation series within my agency where we were able to just talk about how hard this is and how we don't know how to feel and how we don't know how to process. And I think that that's important when we're thinking about, right, all this equity work, this critically important work that we do when it comes to advancing everybody. We need to start with building relationships.
It's definitely a key part in building relationships, and in particular, and there are steps and stages. Everyone doesn't necessarily rush to being friends or rush. There has to be our own personal work that we need to do with ourselves first to be able to come together in our highest self. But, I think where we try to specialize is bringing people together who may not otherwise come together. So that is a specific skill that we've been working to cultivate that, I don't believe we do it perfect, but I think we do make a sincere effort in bridging those gaps. And sometimes bridging those gaps can be the difference.
And I want to hear more about that, but can you go back and you mentioned that kind of inner work that needs to be done as kind of, that seems like foundational. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So I would offer a little historical perspective. And of course, speaking of myself first and then speaking to the broader community. So even how I approached this work, number one, it was from a space of survival in Oakland. So I did this work because we were being targeted, and, based on the elders where I came from, giving up and giving in and being anything less than, a full thriving being was not an option. So therein lies the tension. Where I'm from, you have no choice but to step up into the challenges that come before you. So if you just talk about law and order, there's a principle that we refer to as ma'at. Ma'at stems from the colonizers will call it Egypt. We will refer to the space as Kemet. But this is a principle that's thousands of years old that many communities of color have embraced and called it their own name. But Ma'at is essentially the law in harmony, universal laws and principles that govern the world that we live in. And so for those of us who embrace Ma'at and work within it, then the idea is that hopefully you'll thrive as a result. And for those who seek to dominate, destroy, and to violate the universal principles, then usually the outcome isn't too positive. And so we start, number one, from, I guess, a place of centering our own ancient wisdom, centering our own communal wisdom, and operating from that place. So now when we talk about engaging with law enforcement and community, right, we can have healthy conversations about accountability. You know, community oversight of law enforcement is something I have a lot of experience in for a reason. Training with law enforcement is something I have experience in because, quite frankly, when it came to certain topics, we were just more qualified to do it, right? And then now the phase now post George Floyd is now healing from that trauma, because without the healing aspects, then we will be engaging with one another through filters of trauma. Nothing positive will come from that. So healing is an integral component. My wife and business partner, she is an initiate of Thich Nhat Hanh Zen Buddhism. So the concept of inner being, what impacts me impacts you, what impacts you impacts me. So they're just they're steps and stages along our just path in our own cultural rites of passages that inform the work that we do. And so if you come from this space, then by the time we engage together, even if there's conflict, we are coming from a place of preservation of life principles. So that informs, you know, the conversation of how we engage and kind of how we approach our work versus just what's the latest theory. And, you know, equity is just a new form of Ma'at. These are principles that we have that have been embedded in the fabric of our communities for generations, right? So I don't need a cop to teach me how to be in order. I just have to embrace that which I already am.
Wow. And as we're getting to this deep diving a little bit more into equity, I want to, you know, back up for a minute and really spell out the difference between equality and equity, right? For, you know, a lot of people, they don't recognize that those are different terms. So tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. I will integrate and I will use another anecdote. You can tell I'm a storyteller. It's the way we communicate. And even I'm talking about, Chris, a little bit where you were speaking about as far as the internal work. You know, we encourage people to show up as their whole selves, but also as their highest self too. So whatever that means to participants, like that is the expectation as well. Not perfection, but in your highest self. So when I arrived in Oregon, you know, the word that was tossed around was colorblind. Engaging with students being colorblind, I don't see color, right? And in that regard, that came from the 1980s diversity work and treating everybody the same. Well, the problem is in a society that's embedded upon Native genocide, slavery, yada, 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 the Oregon exclusion laws. I mean, so we can't treat everybody the same if everybody hasn't had the same principles, and particularly if people have been targeted because of their race. So the notion is just, it actually causes more harm. So equity, it takes into, at least this is my version. A lot of people have different takes on it, but my version is we have to consider the power dynamics in play. So race is not a real thing. It's not a social genetic thing, right? It's more of like one might call it more like a caste system. So the so equity, it includes the power dynamics that are embedded within race. So even when I was NAACP, right, we would lead the conversation with race because, for example, the Oregon exclusion laws, that's how they targeted us. That's how they stripped us of rights. So we have to use systemic rights against this systemic problem. But there were also caveats. So even there were times when I was NAACP legal redress chairman in the city of Corvallis where we made an honest, what do we call it? We made a decision to make sure we included white residents who lived in rural areas. Not that we excluded anyone, But we made it attention to also, because there were dynamics that, while these folks may not have been from a BIPOC community, their rural status still had certain circumstances that were inequitable. Yeah. And so anyway, so that's the difference. Equity, it ties in a power dynamic, where equality is more just about the color spectrum.
That was really helpful for me. I mean, that was probably the best definition of equity that I've ever heard. But I'm very uninformed at this point. Are there other kind of terms that in order to kind of enter into this space and continue this conversation at a high level, for me, I need to make sure that I have a good understanding of some of these kind of critical terms as we continue this conversation. What else besides equity do you feel like is worth kind of defining?
As there is to anything, there's levels to this work. So depending on who you're engaged with and where they're coming from. So again, I've kind of shared a little bit about kind of the initiatic perspective, myself and partners and co-author being initiates in our own respective cultural rites of passages, where our elders teach us and deem us qualified to teach or to sit amongst them. Without something like that, then we're just relying on dominant degrees and dominant validation to be empowered to be in a space of leadership. And a lot of times that perpetuates more harm, because those spaces where we get these degrees are also steeped in white supremacy culture, et cetera. So a couple of terms that have risen that are rising out of the work that I'm currently doing and will have been embedded. So number one, of course, race. We lead the conversation with race. Patriarchy. Patriarchy is another one where someone like myself would be in a space, instead of a target identity, I would be in space of a dominant identity as a man. So as a man, I have certain, and this is just my basic definition, but as a man, I have certain privileges just in my gender role. As someone who may not, maybe it's, so patriarchy is the kind of also in the embedded power dynamics of being a man and being and the way that I'm expressed as a man, how it's quote unquote the norm that society would measure anyone else off of as far as gender. So for anyone who doesn't measure up as a man as far as how society would define, well, then they're going to have a whole myriad of issues that for me, I would be probably completely blind to. So patriarchy is definitely one. Colonialism. Colonialism takes into consideration the power dynamics of who's in control of that occupying space. So I'll give you a quick anecdote to illustrate that. As a teacher of English to speakers of other languages, I taught students from all around the world. So in order for them to perform optimally in my class, I had to know how to say hello in all of their languages. I had to understand the pragmatics, which is whose hand do I shake, who can appropriately do a kiss on the cheek, or two, who do I not shake hands with? And I had to understand how to engage all of my students in the same space every day. And the only thing they had in common was they didn't speak the same language. Everything else was different. So there was a time when there was a earthquake in Japan, and we were told explicitly by our administration not to talk about it. Well, as a teacher, I can't not talk about it. So I went against what was, kind of that mandate, and I opened up the can. And so in class, and I'm sharing, how do we feel? So everybody's going around the class. I'm, sorry this happened, this and that. And then we got to a student who said, good, I'm happy it happened. Good. Whoa, time out. Now I've opened something up as a teacher. Now I've got to deal with it, right? And so, well, now I've got to, if we go deeper into this, it could get worse. So I'm here and I've got to go into it now. So I asked, why? And so he explained to me as being a student from South Korea and the colonial relationship between Japan and South Korea, and for him losing his grandparents in that conflict, right? So for him, he's coming from a place of intergenerational trauma, and that took his grandfather away. And so that's where, because I was ignorant of the colonial relationship of the countries in my space, I can perpetuate even more harm. So these are just different ways that equity can manifest themselves in a variety of different ways if we are not conscious. And that's why our brand is community conscious policing, 21st century conscious leadership. So yeah, those would be a few terms.
A term you just used at the end in there that I want to look a little deeper at is generational trauma. That is a term that is new to me. Now, generational trauma is not new to me, but the term and understanding it is new to me. And I was reading a book recently, and part of this book, they had exercises you can do. And one of them was to imagine your ancestors from 3 generations ago, right? So this would have been 1800s type ancestors. And, I'm black and white. And, it took me a minute for my brain to process, who am I looking at? Am I looking at a white person or am I looking at a black person? And then eventually thought of a black person. I thought of a older black woman, gray hair, wearing overalls, kind of the standard Southern look. And then I started to cry because I didn't know them, and it was this really emotional moment for me. And as I started reading more in the book, it was talking about generational trauma and how we've learned so many things about how we interact, how we treat each other, how we treat ourselves, how we treat other black bodies, how we treat white bodies, how we going into all of that. And it was just really powerful for me.
Well, I think a lack of an understanding or an appreciation of that also is kind of how people, I don't know, how maybe people push back against modern experiences and saying, well, how does slavery affect us today? How is that possible?
These are both great examples. So I'll, again, lead with my own experience. Some of these I'll get into. I share more in depth. So the first book that I wrote, Best Practices in Community Conscious Policing, a reflection on law enforcement community building workshops. It actually was more of a story of the work of Training for Transformation and its origins, and I really tried to keep my own lived experience out of it and have it more of a manual. Now, post George Floyd, even that's not acceptable even for me in the work that I do. I've had to really bear it all for the reader and, allow the reader, the listener, to be kind of not the judge, but to be able to assess me and to give that sniff test, right? Is this the real thing, right? And I think all leaders have to be willing to do that. So a little bit of what I share in the next edition, which is Community Conscious Policing, a guide for people's justice and law enforcement solutions. One thing I found was law enforcement and community usually didn't have the same information that they were learning from. So this book is an effort to bridge that gap. But in answer to your question in regards to number one, what I would offer, Marcus, is from a I'm not a counselor, so I don't know. I'm not speaking from an expert, but from a Western lens, you might have described a traumatic reflection of the process that it took you to re-engage with an ancestor, right? And maybe you just kind of personified a pain, or personified a trauma. From an ancestral lived experience lens, right? Back in the day, you didn't have to go through an initiation because the elders had done it. The pillars had done it. So Martin Luther King was not a Prince Hall Mason, but his father was. The two people, Dr. Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson, two people close to him were. So you didn't have to necessarily go through it yourself because it was the culture around you. Now we're so isolated to where there's a big difference. So what I would offer is the way I would view the reflection of your ancestor is, and so I can't speak for you, unless it's just a painful, traumatic incident, but outside of that, I've never cried for a stranger. Unless the incident was so traumatic that as a person, so my point is if your response was to cry or to share or to have an emotional connection, then our lens would say No, you had it at a moment with your ancestors. Like, you came in connection with something that was already embedded within you, and it's just like you kind of scraped something off and then stumbled upon something. It was like, whoa, and that sense of knowing comes through you in a way that can be earth shattering, right? And so I would offer that was a very real experience, and you can go even deeper with that and with that deeper level of engagement. So as far as what does it look like today? Slavery looks like today. So my father died at 37 of hypertension and kidney failure. His brother died at 40 years old of hypertension and kidney failure. My grandfather, who I never met, died of hypertension and kidney failure. So at 18, what did you think was going to happen to me, right? And so that's how I live my life. So these threads that come from these traumatic incidents are still embedded within us. And when we are placed in similar conditions, then those incidents start to kind of like pop off in our bodies. And if you keep going through them, then they'll start to connect themselves into this like pain trauma web. And so for us, the way the human brain works, and I'm not a doctor, but I'm just telling you real talk, that our brain can't decipher between the real thing and just looking at it on TV. So our brain is reacting to these videos of people looking like me getting killed and murdered over and over and over and over and over. So those parts of my body, then boom, they wake up. And that's where you start to get the sickle cell and all the racism in public health, all of the issues that impact black, brown bodies, but for others, it's not that bad, even with COVID. So that's that thread that are ever present, right, as far as trauma. And if trauma healing is not a part of the process, then you might survive in Oakland. 1 out of 4, when I was coming up, 1 out of 4 people, 1 out of 4 black men would get killed in a homicide between the ages of 16 and 24. That's 25%. If you survived a homicide, 1 out of 3 was going to see the inside of a jail cell, corrections, right? That's 33%. If you survived that, then you had racism in public health. That's where what I just brought up, the hypertension, the kidney failure, the this, the that. So you see all those landmines a black man has to, or black families have to navigate just to make it to 40 for me to sit here with you, right? And a lot didn't make it.
There's so much that I think about just starting behind the 8 ball, right? But I had never really considered the physiological components that you just kind of surfaced for me. So that's really fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah. And as we, you brought up corrections in part of that story, and so it just kind of perfect segues into, we're talking about community corrections here, right? And when we first brought this up to you, we met over Zoom and talked about kind of what we were wanting to do and the conversation we wanted to have with you. And one of the things that Chris and I have been asking people is when you hear the term community corrections, what does that bring up to you? Like, what is that? What feelings does that evoke for you, right? And you responded, and it was just like those words are at odds with each other. And that's our field, And so, tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. Number one, I just have to, our motto at Training for Transformation is real life, real talk, real change. So number one, I think it says something about you two to be able to engage in real life conversations, right, and different perspectives, because otherwise these types of voices wouldn't be uplifted. So I just want to honor that. Second, another historical perspective. So you brought up the historian. I'm no longer serving that role, but forever I will be educating around the topic. So Prince Hall Freemasonry is it is the oldest active organization started and run by Africans in America. That's how we refer to ourselves back then. In this country. So anything that you can think of in regards to organizing, anything in regards to the black community, and then of course other communities who came after us utilize these lessons learned for themselves, started in some way, shape, or form with the Prince Hall family. So Prince Hall Freemasons was the fraternity. The Order of Eastern Stars was a sorority. So was for women. So for example, Rosa Parks in the movement was a member of the Order of Eastern Stars. So a lot of times we'll get spoon-fed our leaders as individuals, but not understand the network and how they engaged systemically to respond to these issues. So when we speak about, the origins go back to like 1778, 1784, right? So Prince Hall was an American revolutionary. He fought in the Boston Massacre. The first person to die in the American Revolution was a black man, Crispus Attucks. The list goes on and on and on as far as what he contributed, and was recognized posthumously by the Cambridge City Council as a black founding father. Has a monument on Harvard Square recognizing his contribution. So the history here kind of has to be uplifted to even understand where I would be coming from. And so when you think about corrections for me, now, number one, I'm a novice. I spend more of my time on this actual stop, because I feel like that's where everything begins.
The traffic stop.
Right, the traffic stop. And so that's where has been my training in law enforcement. So respectfully, I can't speak as an expert in corrections. So let me just begin and recognize my own limitations. But what I would offer as far as just in theory, the idea of corrections for me stems, I believe, 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. There were when slaves would run away, in quotes, run away from the plantation in search of freedom, then they were kind of like groups that were deputized to be able to go and get these slaves and bring them back on the plantation where they belong. So this idea is still kind of what I experienced as a freeborn black person, right? Anytime I'm doing things academically in whatever genre, right, that is extraordinary or just simply living my life, there's going to be this reminder and this force to bring me back and put me back on that plantation, right? So historically, the idea of community and corrections from my community would be adverse to one another. If there was investment in community as there was in corrections, then there probably wouldn't be as much need for corrections. So that's kind of where historically, for me, I just kind of described the headache. It was like, and it was like, boom. But with that being said, and getting to know you all and sitting here, I more understand of where you all were coming from in terms of what it should be and what it could be. So I respect that vision.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and that's kind of what Chris and I are all about is trying to better and advance community corrections to improve lives, and that's our whole goal and mission here. What difference do you see, like any like critical differences that you see with your experience working with law enforcement versus somebody like us in the community corrections field?
I think there are a couple of things that are helpful. Number one, we had a chance to meet without either one of us being in our quote-unquote uniforms. So we were able to meet kind of uncloaked. So I've never seen you both in your respective uniforms as it relates to what your jobs are or may have been. A lot of times that can be like a block depending on where one is on their spectrum. Number two, I have to honor that I'm able to engage in these conversations because I did have a certain level of accountability. Without having certain levels of accountability on my journey, then I probably wouldn't be open to have the capacity to engage in more of these types of conversations. So I would say, in general, I could sum up where law enforcement in general is or should be transitioning from. Is simply, as a fraternal guy, it's fraternal culture. I mean, so a patriarchal culture that centers, what it means to be a man, survival of the fittest, the strongest, all the stuff that nowadays is quite frankly outdated. So that was the culture when I first began working with law enforcement that we stepped into. In some spaces, not all, some spaces were very inviting. Some spaces were very transparent. Some spaces really demonstrated their values with us. And without those types of partnerships, we wouldn't be here. But on the other side, there were a lot of bravado, a lot of characteristics that got them in trouble. And they had to figure it out the hard way. With you all, or at least in this experience, and what I would hope to be in other corrections experience, is a human approach. Just be human. I'm trying. Hopefully, I didn't approach you with any titles. Just be human. But also, at least in this experience, right, at least in our engagements together, you all have been very thorough with me. I can tell the amount of investment that went into having a conversation. So that's kind of what we do, where others might be focused on what's the outcome and results driven, and however we get there it doesn't matter what it takes to get there. As long as we get there, we're very process, and how we get there is probably even more important than the result. And, just so for me is a core value of it is an absolute privilege and honor to be in a position to engage with the community that you serve. So if you get the privilege, then you approach it as though it's an altar in between you and the community. You bring your highest self, and you come just as equipped as you would for that job interview. So those are, I guess, traits that, I've experienced in this short time with you all compared to kind of the culture that when we first began a few years ago, there's some training space we walked into that were straight up hostile, and we had to navigate those.
Yeah. And, one of the things that we focus on here at Corrections Community is change leadership, right? And the power of implementing best practices and being the best version of ourselves, right? Being that higher self that you mentioned, and something that you mentioned earlier was conscious leadership. And can you talk about, right, as you're one of the people leading the charges for change in Oregon, but across the nation, right? How do we help our leaders? How do we help the people that are titular leaders. I knew I was going to butcher that word because it's really hard to say. But are, in those positions of that patriarchal power, right? How do we influence that conscious leadership change?
Mm-hmm. Depending on where you are, and my answer is, so I'll approach this by saying, again, from a historical lens, obviously that's kind of like my background and how I approach this work. When we came up, it was more like, okay, who are you? Are you Dr. Martin Luther King, nonviolent? Are you Malcolm X? Are you, by any means necessary? Are you Huey, Dr. Huey, self-defense? Like you had to pick an ideology and really, nowadays, especially with technology, I would say in regards to change leadership, that it's more about, now you have the technology. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to have access to discover wisdom in whatever lane you're choosing, whether that's abolishing law enforcement, defunding law enforcement, whatever you're coming from. And so depending on what you're dealing with locally, I would say lean on whatever ideology serves you best from history, because there are different law enforcement agencies have different accrediting agencies, so there's no one size fits all. But for myself, I think it was what was unique, again, coming from an initiatic perspective, was we had things like the Code of Human Behavior. These are kind of like the 77 commandments culturally that we work to adhere to. So again, they prioritize preservation of life principles. So when we got, whether it's the U.S. Constitution or whatever the code, the laws or et cetera, that's fine. We ethically work within the law, but we had something of our own culture to compare it to. So if you look at Prince Hall, who was the first, as far as I'm concerned, first civil rights organizer of this country, he took the U.S. Constitution or the Declaration of Independence and compared it to universal laws and principles that we all adhere to. I mean, if we're making documents that don't adhere to, it's something that governs us all, then, right? And so without a knowledge of self and who we are, then you'll accept anything. And I think finally what I would say is there's been scenarios where I've had to sue and win for police misconduct that resulted in a monetary settlement, resulted in disciplinary actions against the officers. There's times where I was not, the officers were the institution agreed with the officers and I wasn't satisfied with it. So we worked to shut down the Internal Affairs Department and reallocate that money to fund the Community Police Review Board to oversee our own complaints against police. So depending on what the scenario calls for, will determine, if it's an individual issue or if it's a pattern of practice. And so sometimes, we make leadership an offer they can't refuse. And whether they know it or not, back to conscious leadership, this is a cultural paradigm shift, organizational paradigm shift that's occurring, period, in the world. So step out of law enforcement and community for any leadership that's not a part of shifting their culture in which they govern, meaning from left brain to integrating right brain strategies to at a variety of different levels, being more equitably sound. If you're not making no shift, you're going to find yourself outdated, irrelevant, in trauma, facing liabilities, the cause of violence. You don't have to worry. It will, you will find yourself in a situation. So it's, sometimes we make the change and sometimes we're a part of the change.
Got it. Go ahead.
I share that belief that this is what we're talking about. What you just described, Brandon, is just it's critical competencies and actions for modern leaders or the next generation of leaders. Now, you've had some your work through Training for Transformation. You've got to work with, advise, counsel some senior leaders, at least in the law enforcement side of things. Can you tell me a little bit about what have you seen? How have those interactions gone for the most part? What do you find maybe consistent for the more receptive leaders, the strong leaders, the more effective leaders?
Generally speaking, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I was quite surprised at speaking about leadership of law enforcement in general, and even in my time in here in Oregon specifically. I think overall, in general, law enforcement leaderships, and again, my background has been with law enforcement organizations, not necessarily in corrections, is all of them may not get or understand racial equity, but any of them, and I think it's because they are in jobs that could be life and death any day. So I think they understand the importance of being on point. And we've gotten a lot of positive reception from law enforcement leaders who saw how we were working to engage, the benefits of it, and invited us in. And when I say invited us in, that's how we got access to the police law enforcement training, at least statewide. And we were able to critique it from a community lens and when I first started this work, I didn't know the difference between a chief, captain. You put somebody in front of me, I'm gonna tell them the truth, and that's kind of how it began. And I think a lot of them we appreciated the candor, and they could get a perspective and version of the truth that was well informed that they couldn't get otherwise. So I was quite. In some ways it was healing for me that there was such a good reception, and then how to bring the rest of the department on board, I think, is another question. And another question as far as politicians who control the funding, for them to understand the importance of funding small businesses like mine versus the same old two-step that keep getting us into that stuff. So that's kind of more where the struggle has been, I think, for us.
I really appreciate that you said that. You don't know the difference between person's titles, it's you're a person, and it seems like that is a foreign concept to a lot of folks. Just that, when I look at someone, you are a person first. I don't care if you are the president of the United States, if you are, a general in the armed force. You're a person, and I'm going to address you as a person. And I feel good about myself in doing that. And, whether or not you receive that well, that's on you. That's kind of the way that I think. And I know I'm in the minority on that because, as Brandon mentioned earlier, there is this dominant culture, that we have all been conditioned to live in. And trying to go against the grain on that is hard. And it is something that requires intention. It requires work. I catch myself, as I do my work now. I work in an office of equity and inclusion. I get paid to do this, and I still struggle with it. It's hard. It is hard to remember that the person across from me is my boss, but you're a person first. It's hard.
Mm-hmm. 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 It's not easy. Facts.
Um, as we've been wrapping here, one of the things that's just been kind of floating around in my mind is I want to ask you this question. If I asked somebody else's question, I got a really good answer, and so I want to ask you as we're talking. If you were given the abilities to be the, I don't know, master of corrections and law enforcement, and you could institute one change, implement one change and implement it perfectly so that every officer in the state of Oregon and nationally or whatever has this, what do you change?
It's going to be the process. And quite frankly, I think that community conscious policing is that for us, is that for me. Community conscious policing, while it covers police accountability, it covers law enforcement training, it covers healing from trauma. You know, we've talked a lot about community members, our trauma, but we got to be honest, based on the research and the data, right, as far as law enforcement officers, and this is no excuse, right, because as a profession, you're paid tax dollars by the community that you serve. So there's an embedded power dynamic that has to be teased out compared to someone like I've described who we've just been historically marginalized and oppressed. I mean, that's a different level of pressure. But, you know, the health disparities in law enforcement field, you know, higher levels of domestic violence, all suicides in middle-aged white men. I mean, there are things wreaking havoc in regards to havoc even within law enforcement. So I think in regards to your question, community conscious policing was to ensure that the people who would be most impacted are, whether that's policy, training, whatever, are centered. That means if I have to choose from the word of a police officer versus the word of a community member who was historically been a victim of these types of crimes, if somebody gets the benefit of the doubt, I'm going to censor the experience of the person who's most impacted by default, right? And if it doesn't pass the sniff test or whatever, then things equitably will be worked and ironed out. But no longer will that community member have to prove that racism existed. We already assume that it's here based on the historical information that we know of. So that's what I would offer, is that the process is the key factor that we do is to, who are the people who don't have access to NAACP? Who are the people who are having the language barrier so they don't even know who to call? So if you've lived in another country, not visited as a study abroad, I mean had an apartment, woke up with the people, went to work with the people, ate with the people, then you know what it's like that, to be that other and to not have access to the same rights and et cetera. So if you come from that place, then who are those folks who don't have the access, and how do we find them and authentically? So for us, I would always do the community outreach. So for any training that we did, I would do the outreach, and it was about going, discovering who were those that were most impacted, where they were, how do I speak to them in lay language if I can, and how do I roll up my sleeves and work on what's important for them right now. And in that process, if I'm able to authentically engage or be invited into their space, then they're like, yo, well, then what you do? And you get to talk, and they're like, yo, that happened to you? Well, man, I'm working with the person who's over that. If you want to just come tell them. And set up the scenario and prepare, the institution and prepare them to have this engagement. And so community conscious policing was that process to where everybody is able to contribute, confront their own biases, give their feedback, glean the information, and then go back with the leadership and say, so my feedback, it doesn't say cop in cop in community. Everybody showed up in regular clothes. Nobody had no guns. So the feedback I got is just people in this area. And so based on this feedback, this is what they're saying that they want to see. So now let's go look at how you're allocating your budget. Who are you hiring? How are you hiring them? So we look at all of your processes and inform them with the information that was gleaned directly from people who are impacted the most and centering what they want. And we help the institution integrate that. So by the end of the process, then it's like everyone doesn't get everything that they want, but everyone should be able to see something that they contributed into what their local police or jails or whatever looks like. So without this type of process where people who are most impacted are centered and at the architectural table of things that are going to impact them, we'll be playing Ring Around the Rosie to the end of time. And that's where someone like me was like, I'm getting off the hamster wheel. Historical perspective, been there before, seen that before, done that before. And so our community conscious policing was kind of like the Tesla model. We, instead of trying to make the new Benz, the new 10 series, just scrap the whole idea of a car and just what's the best way to get power sustainably? Oh, let's use the sun battery. I love that. And we just reconstructed what a training experience should look like.
Yeah, I love that. I use the term confronting bias in that segment. And I've been thinking a lot about that, about how bias can show up in our assessments and just in our interactions. And I'm really been hyper focused on what those interactions look like from a parole and probation officer and a client, someone who is just as involved, or a person of color who happens to be just as involved. What do those interactions look like? And bias is one of those things that it's so insidious. And that confrontation of it, I haven't seen. You used hamster wheel as well. I haven't seen a lot of real successful approaches to resolving that and reconciling that bias and moving beyond that. And that's where my struggle is right now. Is how do we approach that so it's not just a conversation or an assessment? You've heard these bias assessments, but how do we actually affect change in these areas?
And I think that's a perfect time to bring up your book, because is that the focus of your book? Yeah.
It is. I appreciate it. So again, the title, Community Conscious Policing, a Guide for People's Justice and Law Enforcement Solutions. So to save you some time, there's an article that I would share with your listeners. It's called Diversity Trainings Usually Fail. Here's what you can do to make lasting changes, I believe. Shout out to Dr. Gassam, who was the author and interviewer. She's an incredible talent, and I'm eternally indebted, grateful for her for inviting me for an interview. So this was an interview I did in Forbes, and it was an opportunity to kind of lay out some of my not my research, but just understanding after doing this work around implicit bias as a reference for folks, because this will be a stepping stone that we all have to come across. So, check out. So let's just talk about implicit bias. The implicit association test, based on my understanding, originated out of Harvard University. There were maybe, to my recollection, about 3 kind of co-founders. Well, what we found over time is a couple of things, and I'm a little rusty here, so you have to go read the article that has the technical information as stated and quoted in the research. But based on my limited recollection, this is what I knew to be true. So, for example, I would speak to a student and say, be called into a situation with law enforcement, and it's around bias. But when I talk to the person, they're like, no, he stopped me because I was black. I don't know what you mean about unconscious bias. He saw me. It was a black dude. He stopped me. I mean, I can't get no more racist than that. So, again, the versions of the stories. And so implicit association test. So let me just, for those who haven't taken it, and I haven't taken it. Let me be honest. I haven't taken it. But what I've studied about it, right, is a couple of the issues could be, yes, it's not it's subjective. So how one could perform one day on a bias assessment compared to how the same person performs next week on the bias assessment. I mean, it could fluctuate and it can vary. There are variables involved, right? So yes, maybe the bias is being assessed, but if I'm tired this day and versus more well-rested that day, right? And it's the same thing on the street. If I catch you in the first hour and you as a law enforcement officer or corrections, you're going to give me all your splendor. You're going to be patient. You're going to be understanding. You're going to remember everything we talked about today, and you're going to do everything right. Let me catch you on hour 13. So, right, that's what a real life, real talk, real change. So, can we associate this with bias, et cetera? So what they found was there's no causal link. So let's just say I got someone who's easily very biased, right? And I can probably tell who they're biased against, right? there's no causal link that says if I can rid him of that bias, then he's going to discriminate less. Or a causal bias, a link that says if I can prove he's biased on this test, that he's going to go out and discriminate more than anybody else. So the causal link is not there. And so it was, I'm not going to say it was promoted, but let's just say it was not uplifted, and there was a lot of money back. This is my opinion, but a lot of money going back and forth between institutions and white men around implicit bias, but nothing hitting the street for me, nothing helping you if you've encountered me. We still having to deal with real life circumstances. So that's why nothing has helped. Just a lot of money's been spent, a lot of money's been made. So for me, it was about interrupting, like literally disrupting that whole, process, right? So we do things by, consciously, what you could do in a bias assessment compared to what I can do in a role play based on experiential learning. You're not going to ever hold a candle to me, ever, because we're dealing with real life, real talk, real change. You're still stuck on the theory and the head. We over here shifting from head to embodiment. So the different caliber officer I'm going to engage with in that moment, man, I mean, he's going to have in that one moment, of a gun or whatever, the considerations that's going to be flashed before his head compared to somebody who just takes some bias assessment and got some little, you know what I mean? It's going to be night and day. So they're really anything around implicit bias, I think is, I can't say anything and everything, but that's just not a reality that I live in.
Got it. Wow. Well, what a great conversation we've had today. There is still so much more to unpack, so much more to talk about, and have these real talks about it. But we're out of time today. We very much appreciate you being here. One of the things that we like to do when we end our episodes is like to take a few things that we've talked about just through our conversation that folks that are listening to this podcast, whether they work in community corrections, whether they're just kind of the casual listener, that they can implement in their daily life today to start being better, right? And so I wrote a lot down, but I pulled 4 key ones out here. And so I'm going to start. The first one, and this is kind of how we started, is the power of storytelling, right? We can't just have quantitative data when working with communities of color. It's not enough. We need to have a conversation and value that over just focusing on the outcomes. And that leads into the second one, which is start with building relationships. Let that be your starting point. Bringing people together, as you said, is part of your mission, is bringing people together who may not have already been together, is critical to advancing change when it comes to equity work, especially in corrections and law enforcement lenses. And then the last 2 are things you said that have just really resonated with me. Show up as your whole self and your highest self, which doesn't mean be perfect. Doesn't mean that at all. I've spent a lot of time talking about showing up as my whole self, and I've really focused and centered that, but I haven't thought about showing up as my highest self as well. And so that's something that I can do right now. And I love that. So thank you for that. And then the last one is something that you said over and over again, and you modeled over and over again, which is lead with your own experiences. Don't speak for others. Tell your own story.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, Brandon, this was just obviously we record these, and we hope that the wisdom you've shared today resonates for anyone who's comes across this information, this content. But I can tell you selfishly, for me personally, this has been really valuable as well. I mean, I would have valued this had the recorders been off, right? Just sitting and connecting with you and hearing your story and how that has led to the actions you've taken, the passion that you have for this work, and also just I'm thinking about always, how do I make this actionable? And Marcus always does a fantastic job of summarizing those steps for us at the end of this. So, yeah, any other kind of parting words?
Number one, again, thank you for inviting me into your space. For anyone who had the chance to listen to our conversation together, I appreciate the invitation to share space with corrections as career. And for anyone who, I'm speaking for someone, my wife, she's a Cambodian refugee, so there's an aspect of the idea of war that we don't agree with as peace builders. But I have to acknowledge, my father, all of my uncles, both of my grandparents, they all served in the military, the tradition of Prince Hall Freemasonry. So anyone who is of service, considers themselves a public servant, I can want to make sure I part this conversation out of respect for anybody who's showing up to do their best in times that are difficult. The last two things that I will leave on is that I would probably add to your list is, even for myself, let's do our own work. If you want to do something today, man, start unpacking your own privilege. What are the spaces where you hold dominance? What are the spaces where you hold privilege? If you're someone who's impacted, man, how do you tap into your cultural resources, your ancient wisdom? Our ancestors have been thriving under this kind of pressure for millennia. We taught law and order to humanity. So tap into who you are. And I would say, that's why we consider consciousness to be our brand. So thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. For Corrections Community, Marcus Ford, Brandon Lee, Chris Chandler, thank you.